Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of slavery in the colonial era, and in this lesson we're going to begin talking about a different aspect of slavery, slavery and self-determination. A historian named Stanley Elkins wrote a book in the mid-20th century in which he compared slavery to concentration camps and described the slaves as being so completely and utterly beaten down and humiliated that they couldn't conceive of any kind of resistance and essentially had no lives of their own. Now, scholars since that period have begun to correct Elkins and the historical record. They've been paying more attention to the slaves as determining, to whatever degrees they could, determining their own fate and making some kind of lives for themselves, even in the midst of slavery. So in this lesson, we're going to be discussing that aspect of slavery, slavery and self-determination. So one important thing to consider when we think about slavery and self-determination is that slavery itself as an institution was very malleable and changing. It differed greatly depending on the time and the place. It varied in the degree, the extent of the harshness, the treatment of the slaves, the kind of work they did, and thus it differed in the amount of freedom that the slaves had, and therefore how much they might have been able to shape their own lives. It also differed depending on whether more slaves were being imported from Africa or whether more of them were born in America. So we need to talk a little bit about some of those regional differences again, and then consider how that might have impacted their ability to shape their own lives. So when we think about some of the factors related to self-determination and slavery, the number of slaves on a given plantation or working wherever it was, the distance from the master's house, the type of work performed, and again, whether more of the slaves were African-born or were they Creole, were they born in the Americas but into slavery. And we can look at a couple of different images and just think about some of those variations. So if you look at an image like this one, we're obviously dealing with a very large plantation system, but you've got the master's house back there in the distance, and all of these are different slave quarters. And so we can imagine that within those slave quarters, when they're on their own time in the evening or at night, they would have some degree of freedom, at least to talk amongst themselves and do various activities without the master or an overseer being right there. Here's a different look at what slavery might have looked like in some regions. So again, we're dealing with a large plantation. They're working outdoors. They're very spread out. But you see the masters and overseers are very close to some of them, while others, perhaps down the line, you can imagine they might have been able to talk to each other or whisper without the overseers hearing. And then here is one more variation where you're dealing with a much smaller kind of system. They are working with tobacco, but people are very close to each other, and it would have been very easy for someone to keep an eye on them. So there are endless variations in these kind of things. I just show you these pictures to give you an idea of some of the possibilities. So let's revisit our thinking about slavery in Virginia and how it might have impacted the slaves' ability to determine, to some extent, their own fate. Well, first of all, again, Virginia changes over time, and slavery in Virginia changes over time. Prior to 1700, the number of slaves was relatively small, and most slave owners, if they did own any, they owned only a few slaves. So this would not have been great for slaves trying to maintain their culture. They wouldn't have had too much contact with each other. But as slavery grows, and particularly after 1740, the numbers of slaves are growing and the size of individual plantations are growing. So after 1740, you see many more plantations that had more than 10 slaves per plantation. So you have a much larger population, and their ability to interact and communicate with each other and kind of maintain some of their culture and practices would have been greater. So let's think about really after that period of about 1740. One thing that slaves in Virginia did during this period is they maintained a sort of network running from one plantation to another, paths kind of through the woods connecting different plantations. This was known as the Grapevine Express. So this network of relationships and communication allowed the slaves to keep each other informed of events, to carry on relationships, and even to carry on families from one plantation to another, and occasionally to plot rebellion, something that we're going to be talking about in a future lecture. While much of this was done in secret, white masters at times would allow these kind of relationships to carry on because they understood that to some degree allowing the slaves a measure of happiness and stable family relationships, even having children from one plantation to another, kept them secure within the institution of slavery. There's a balance throughout the existence of slavery in the colonies between the harshness of the institution, but then if you're too harsh, it's going to encourage and inspire rebellion. So if they allowed a measure of freedom and independence, it might dissuade them from trying to rebel. These slave networks also allowed the slaves to keep some contact with their African roots and culture, and they could maintain various elements of that culture. Things like religion, which evolved, unique religions that sometimes combined African kind of customs and traditions with those in the Americas. So religions like voodoo and Santeria can kind of evolve in secret. In other cases, the slaves would kind of combine traditions of Southern Baptism or Christianity with their own African traditions. Sometimes slaves were able to carry out their own weddings and funerals. Now these had characteristically kind of African traits, and so at times the white masters and overseers would not have recognized what was going on. In other cases, again, they allowed some of these things to happen. They could also keep up some of their musical traditions, although they often had to improvise in terms of instruments. Sometimes they might use spoons or other implements for percussion. In other cases, playing the banjo, various kind of drums or instruments they might make out of gourds and vegetables. And finally, in some cases, Africans were able to maintain some of their traditional forms of magic and sorcery, sometimes casting curses upon their masters. In other cases, again, sort of rebelling in ways that we're going to talk about in future lectures. So we see that in Virginia, at least in the most advanced periods of slavery, the slaves were able to perpetuate African traditions and culture, at least in some ways. And much of what I've discussed with Virginia applies to other parts of the colonies as well, including South Carolina. But I want to talk a little bit about South Carolina separately because there are some unique characteristics there. Some scholars have noted that at times in this period, South Carolina came to resemble Africa more than any other part of the North American colonies. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, first of all, as I've already noted in previous lectures, there were far more African slaves in the colony of South Carolina than anywhere else. And the great majority of these slaves continued to be imported from Africa. So they are first generation immigrants in that sense. They are bringing with them their African culture directly from Africa, as opposed to in other colonies where more and more of the slaves tend to be born in America. In this way, the African culture of South Carolina was refreshed and renewed with the arrival of every new ship. And third, and I mentioned this briefly in a previous lesson, the white landowners in South Carolina tended to leave their plantations for extended periods, particularly during the summer months. So you have very large populations of largely African slaves that are left unsupervised in a way for extended periods of time. And so this is what we mean when we say they came to resemble Africa. So what were they able to do with that kind of more extensive freedom? Well, again, in South Carolina, they're able to express their African culture more fully than in other areas. One thing unique to South Carolina is they created Gullah speech or Geechee, some of these variations on African languages mixed with bits of English that the whites often couldn't understand. And so they were able to use this language, even if whites were nearby, they could speak these foreign languages and kind of mock or insult the owners without them even knowing what was happening. In some cases, they were able to maintain their African names, even if they were given other names by their masters. In their own kind of private circles, they could keep their original names. There were also a variety of jobs, and we talked a little bit about this when I discussed South Carolina earlier. This does change over time, but blacks in South Carolina might pilot boats, they might engage in artisanal activities like blacksmithing or shoemaking, jewelry making, and sometimes were even able to make a profit. And then there are many instances of overt slave resistance, which we're going to be talking about that in a future lecture. There's a final example that I want to mention from South Carolina slavery that was particularly common on the rice plantations. That is another example of the kind of freedoms that slaves were able to exert even under slavery. And that is the task system. In South Carolina, and this was used in other areas as well, but in South Carolina was especially common. So the master would assign a particular project that had to be completed that day. For instance, weeding a quarter of an acre of land or something like that. And then once the slave had finished that work, he had the rest of the day to himself and could do whatever he or she wanted with that free time that remained. And there are a number of instances in which the slaves with that free time were able to grow their own gardens, growing corn, roots, groundnuts, sesame seeds, peppers, in other cases acquiring livestock like hogs or cattle or horses. And in some cases, they were able to build for themselves quite a degree of wealth, at times even establishing their own land, purchasing their freedom, and then in some cases buying slaves of their own. Now, I want to mention one last example that gives you yet another view of the kinds of freedoms that slaves could establish for themselves. And these were the African Creoles or Atlantic Creoles. These were African slaves who mixed and mingled with European sailors. They worked around what we would describe as the Atlantic world, coastal regions from North America to the Caribbean to Africa and Europe. They acquired all kinds of different skills and did lots of different things on the ships, from the basic kind of shipborne duties of working with the sails and so on, but they also often negotiated between merchants, served as translators, or worked various jobs on the coast around the docks. The man pictured here, Equiano, is one example. I read a brief selection from his writing in the previous lesson, and he was one of these Atlantic Creoles who worked on the seas and eventually was able to acquire enough wealth through clever kind of trading to purchase his own freedom. And so this is another example of the slaves exerting a degree of self-determination and independence even within the overall institution of slavery.